So I think what I want to do is try to say something a little differently, and really to reflect additional thoughts I've had about the collective work that we are setting out to do. I also think that part of my contribution to this work is really mobilizing essentially a bully pulpit. It's not the, or even perhaps the biggest one, but it certainly is one, and hopefully one among many, to what has been defined by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences as a crisis in the humanities, with a report issued last year called The Heart of the Matter. I assume some of you, all of you may know of it, some of you may have read it closely, but I think being mindful of what we are all here gathered to focus on and to figure out how to chart a meaningful and constructive path forward, we do have to make the most of the kinds of both evidence in a very general sense and shared communities of allies who are thinking through what does it mean in a nation that, as they define, is not only educating its children poorly, less effectively training its teachers in the humanities, and for them this amounts to a threat to our national security. Now that's sort of government speak. I'm not sure I think we see similar crises. I'm not sure we would couch it in militaristic terms. But to the point of whether or not we can claim a productive citizenry that is inclusive and that has equity built into the framework of our society, I think for me that kind of security really is about cultural security and economic security rather than, say, national security. And I focused on this at a recent talk that I gave at the University of Puerto Rico, really to sort of, no, I'm sorry, at the Ransom Center at the University of Texas. I can't keep up with where I've run my mouth recently. And I guess I just wanted to, for those who haven't read the report, throw out a few things that the report cites. And first, they talk about the declining federal investment has declined by roughly 50% in the humanities. Now, the humanities, by comparison to STEM fields, were always less important to federal funding. But the high water mark was roughly 30% in recent years, has now fallen to 20%, which effectively amounts to a 50% cut in the amount of money the federal government is giving to support general research in the humanities, which is inclusive, I see, of the work that we are engaged in. The other point is that when you compare that to how universities divvy up their allocations for general support of research, the humanities have a much larger slice, which is declining. So universities have essentially carried the weight of the humanities, given that the federal government has never been a major funder of the humanities. But in both cases, the numbers are declining substantially. Why I think this matters is not just that this doesn't necessarily tell us something new, and of course I'm not a big fan of couching, as many of you know, our problems in straight statistical terms. It does give us the kind of talking point that I think we need to be able to say with the imprimatur of the Academy of the Arts and Sciences, we have a problem, and what are we going to do about it? And for them, the issue stretches across the academic communities, but they try to balance a kind of critique of the focus on STEM with a call for action in the humanities. So they don't see this as a zero-sum game, but they do worry aloud in the report about what it means to construct a society that no longer values imagination, that no longer values a kind of appreciation for the soft squishiness that represents the humanities itself. Even the ways in which, as we are all witness to as adults, so much of the soft capital of success, the individual human capital that people bring to their successful careers, generally turns at a certain point in your career on your facility with cultural heritage, with your awareness of, call it world civ, call it American history, however you want to define it. We all know at a certain level that it's those kinds of skills and fluency that really do shape the professional trajectories of people beyond a certain level. So one could argue that maybe STEM becomes a kind of Trojan horse for a new vocational class of employees who will not have that cultural capital if they don't have the arts. And that for the elite, for the privileged, the arts remain core and central to how they educate their own children outside of our public education systems. I think we have to be willing to at least offer research projects that give meat to these such claims. So here I am essentially offering hypotheses that I think people around this table can explore in their own various ways. But I think that STEM has essentially become one angle on a kind of new vocational army. Now, it looks better than the vocational army of the past, but Ainsley, for example, Erickson from Teachers College participated in a conversation at the Schomburg a couple of weeks ago as part of our conversation series, and I can't remember if it was Ainsley. I think it was Ainsley's work in Nashville, Tennessee, where even in the 1970s, I believe is the period she was covering, there were gradations of vocational work. And so the black students were stuck in woodshop and basic mechanics, and the white students in Nashville were learning aeronautical engineering. They were working literally on airplanes. And so I think the bar has risen for what counts as technical knowledge and training today, whether it's coding or building microchips. But at a certain level, there remains still a glass ceiling beyond what it means to have even those basic skills. So I think part of the ruse in the STEM area is that we imagine all of these kids running to Microsoft for high-tech jobs, which are really now the new woodshop mechanical jobs. And that the layer that moves them from those positions of leadership as we imagine them today to the top remain in this soft humanistic space where people know how to talk, walk the walk, and really move and be engaged in large worldly matters. There is, and this is this great point that I've had to land on, and I've been holding it right there. It's been right there for like 250 words, and now it's gone. It has to do with the morning. Good thing I'm not in front of a lot of people right now. Yes, here it is. So one of the things, and this is really a call to sort of think through these things. So we know there is an Asian American achievement gap, or I should say a white achievement gap, by comparison to Asian American counterparts. We also know that Asian American and Asian immigrants are held as exemplars of a kind of commitment to STEM fields. We know that, sort of in the rhetoric of national security, it is BRIC nations, and particularly India, that is leading the way in producing the world's engineers, and they're continuing to come, and Americans are crying foul because they think to themselves, we must, educate our own to do this work. Yet, all the evidence of leadership in our country suggests that for all of that technical know-how that our South Asian engineers bring to the table, they're not running our companies. They're not sitting on the boards of directors across America. They are not the leadership class. So I want to put that in conversation with the work around historical literacy, because I think that's something new to my thinking about this, in the ways in which it calls us to be more critical of exactly what STEM means to the children I think that we are particularly concerned about, particularly poor children, particularly children of African heritage or Latino heritage in this country who remain in our public school systems, the ones who are building on intergenerational disadvantage and continue to be fodder for political debates about what they should be doing. So when someone like Newt Gingrich says, as a presidential candidate in 2012, that black children in Harlem don't see examples of people working hard, not only does this defy the actual reality of working people and how much harder they actually work to make ends meet, but that they should be janitors in their own schools as a means of learning a kind of commitment to a work ethic. That is sort of the raw political discourse of the far right, but somehow I think it squares a lot more neatly than we'd like to imagine with the kind of commitment to STEM. So when someone like Mitch Daniels is becoming a booster for STEM, we should have concern. We should caution, because again, I think the intellectual elite and the political elite of our society fully recognize that privilege and wealth are articulated and expressed in this country through the humanities. I mean, if I go to another cocktail party or gala or benefit and somebody asks me something about some obscure artist that I've never heard of, I'm going to vomit. But that's precisely the world in which people are not engaged. And precisely coming back to the crisis of historical literacy, coming back to the crisis that the heart of the matter identifies, I think, puts the humanities really at the forefront of a larger battle over inequality in our country. So again, I am really talking through these things because I didn't, want to give you something that is more polished for me, because these are new thoughts to me. There are other examples here in this address that I gave at the Ransom Center, mostly drawing from things that are extant in the media, talking about Stanford's imbalance between the number of faculty in humanities versus the number of majors. Harvard's experienced 20% declines. So we also have a consumer demand problem. And the consumer demand problem to me also is about the K through 12 pipeline. So if the teachers aren't prepared to defend the right to teach humanities, if they are not willing to fight for arts education and robust historical literacy and cultural literacy in the classroom, then you're also looking at students who are coming out of our public schools in particular, who are only imagining success as defined by engineering degrees, business degrees, professional degrees. And that consumer side of it then reinforces the policy setting agendas of state legislatures and presidents of universities that say the students don't want to take these classes. They can see that there are no jobs in these areas. So, 20 years ago when I was a student, places like Goldman Sachs was deliberately recruiting people with English majors and history majors because they knew, one, that those kids were smart, and smart people can learn anything, and two, that they would have the ability to think about what they were doing in a bigger context, which ultimately would be down to the benefit of the company, rather than everyone being an automaton with a very narrow, specialized focus on, intuiting financial derivatives. So something shifted, and I'm not sure the Goldman Sachs shifted in its ability to recruit, but I wouldn't be surprised if even there's been an erosion of an appreciation at the hiring level of what it actually takes to produce people who think deeply and critically about the world.
I wanted to add a couple of things. First of all, that was fantastic, even for 20 minutes and holding that idea out there. But there's something I want to come back to that I think is really important, and I think it's going to go a little bit to what you were talking about. I mean, you use this term cultural fluency, which I think is so important in this notion of my niece is in college and she lives with me. I raised her, whatever, and she's like, I have to have a major where I can get a job. And I said, but I want you to study what you love, because what people want and the job that you're going to get is for people who are smart and who can think. So there's this ability to move between the technical, right, all of your mathematics knowledge, but also your ability to interact. I don't know any obscure artists either. I barely know the ones that are well known. But there's this notion of kind of like the cocktail party talk that you need to be able to do. And there has to be some sort of way to emphasize the importance of being able to move through a whole bunch of different areas and have fluency in all of them, because it gives you even greater capital in a whole bunch of ways. So it's really like what you're saying about, you're going to benefit from public speaking, but there's this idea of somehow changing the focus from being vocational with a small v in the sense of working your way towards a career, because we could make the argument that law school is vocational as well. You take this set of courses and you come out and this is how you're going to practice law. But this idea of the importance of thinking, to bring back, and I know I'm totally out of time, in saying, to bring back in a sense the life of the mind, the importance of that, and to be able to show examples. And I think the greatest example fits in with what you were saying is Bill Bennett's new book about how liberal arts education will do nothing for you, and yet he was a philosophy major at Williams and got a PhD in philosophy and got a law degree from the University of Texas and became a secretary, in I forget whose cabinet he was in, and yet a liberal arts education will do nothing for you. So I'm looking at this from like more of this higher ed perspective of bringing people back into the liberal arts and in a sense, for lack of a better way to put it, sort of funneling people into liberal arts colleges as opposed to technical colleges, or the notion that any major that you take is actually going to get you a job, because even if you get an engineering major, you're still going to have to get a master's degree, you're still going to have to go through some sort of training, whatever kind of engineering it is. If you get a degree in accounting, you're still going to have to take more tests and do more exams. And so there's this idea of bringing it back to an emphasis on the ability to think, right? To be able to reason, to think, to break it down beyond discipline, to really think about those kind of skills that you need. And I don't mean, we all use this in all of our curriculum, the notion of critical thinking. Beyond that, how important it is to be able to think, to understand, to reason, and to be able to make those choices. But I really like this idea, and I'd like to come back to it a bunch of times, Betty, in terms of this idea of cultural fluency, because I think that's something that people can understand, is the ability to move in and out of different environments, right?
Not only do I agree with you, Callie, I think it's interesting. I think we all remember E.D. Hirsch and the backlash against cultural literacy. Right. Mm-hmm. But there was a point there when Khalil was talking, and you crystallized it for me as well, where as important as that is, in this new conversation about STEM, which Khalil, I think, was masterful in talking about that as kind of the new wood shop, is that you're pushing kids toward these jobs. But there's still something to be said for education's function as fashioning young people who are able to function in a participatory democracy. And I think part of what gets lost in the way that we think about historical literacy is making the case, as you were saying, where we say, in essence, look, it ties into what some people were talking about earlier in terms of community involvement. In order for us to create or reimagine communities in which young people have a vested interest in the community and a stake in the community, what do they need to do or what do they need to take in order to be a functioning part of this community? Well, one would imagine that they might need 12 credits of accounting. Depending on what neighborhood they live in, they may need some foreign language. So the idea that we can cut out language, which is happening on a lot of college campuses, right, is a problem if you live in the Bronx. You need foreign language. But you also need history, because there's something about the communities in which you live. There's something about knowing what Marcus Garvey Park represents that helps to make you connected to that community. And I think part of our selling point is that, and I hate even using the language selling point, but I think it speaks to Khalil, is part of the idea is that if we're going to reimagine the humanities in a space that makes a case for funding in conjunction with STEM and everything else, it also has to be this case that says, not even aspiring for jobs, but just back to this notion that in a participatory democracy, these are the things that you need to know in order to be able to be a functioning member of the community, unless we're abandoning that totally. And I think that's part of our conversation is reimagining the ways that we do that.
So I wanted to come back in because there are some parts of my thinking that underlie what I just described, and I think it's important to put them back in the conversation. Because I think, one, first of all, STEM is terrific for people who actually are inspired to go on to be engineers. I think it's not a one-size-fits-all. And to me, that's where the workshop question comes into play, which is to say, if we are actively pigeonholing our children into careers in STEM, we are essentially cutting off parts of some of those kids who are never going to find themselves in that. And so in the ways in which their sense of themselves and their confidence matters to their educational success, then we have to give them as much as we can at the earliest pot. We can't. So then that raises a question: why is it that we are choosing to dispense with liberal education as the basis for more specialized educations? Because we have a resource problem. So the same world that produces No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top is a world predicated on the notion that maybe we can't afford to educate everybody equally. Now, that's not what they're going to tell you, but when you have an education system that is promoting reform on the basis of grants, essentially you're saying we're going to make tough choices here, and we're going to reward the schools that seem to be doing better than the ones that others, and the other ones have to get their act together, rather than a notion that a fundamental right to a quality education across the board. So the resource question, I think this group has to also think deeply about: how do you put that in the conversation where you make more visible the fact that school is expensive, that there's tremendous inequality with how resources are dispensed around the quality of education, and that at the highest conceptual levels, STEM essentially guarantees that there'll be a better match with the workforce and the job opportunities, which is essentially contrary to liberal arts education, right? It's not utilitarian. It is, by definition, intended for a person to find themselves across a menu of educational offerings. And again, to me, it is always very difficult to look beyond the ways in which our independent and private schools educate children. I just always want to caution educators, don't let them off the hook. Because until they have shifted all their resources and says, you know what, we're shutting down the library, who needs that? Everyone has a computer, and everyone's going to be doing STEM from now on, or at least that's where we're going to put our focus, then I suggest that why are we being faced with those limited choices? Also, this notion of the politics of knowledge. So we are in a particular moment made more visible by the election of Barack Obama that, again, can't be left aside. That part of the politics of knowledge is that liberal arts education has produced, in the wake of the 1960s, a bunch of red diaper babies who are critics of capitalism, who believe in all sorts of dangerous, permissive values in American society, which, cut against family values. I mean, you know the story. But that's real. And so in these state legislatures, whether it's Arizona, whether it's Texas, or whether it trickles down into the classroom, where recently in Queens, some teacher told a kid, you can't write about Malcolm X for Black History Month because he was a bad guy. That's a commentary on the school, on the teacher, on the larger construct of the politics of knowledge that are playing out across this country. And so there's something about history in particular, as a subset of cultural fluency, that is threatening to the status quo. It's why you have someone like Rick Santorum refer to college as for snobs, or why there's a sustained critique in parts of the country that college is really just a liberal indoctrination. Even if you take that at face value, liberal indoctrination may be the only guarantee we have that in the absence of the exigencies of a capitalist market that will propel many people into the market-based economy to perpetuate the market base, that you at least have people who have conflicted, right? And I'll finish with this point on my own journey. So, none of this for me exists outside of me. So I grew up working in a small business. I wasn't reading Adam Smith, but I most certainly was sort of on the path to wanting to be a business person. Happened to be a computer store, so I was totally enamored by computers. I sold them, I built them. But college not only exposed me to a set of questions that turned out to be more interesting to me as a person, but also that was the first time really I encountered an attack on my culture and my humanity from outsiders for the first time in my life in a sustained way. And I stumbled as a result of it. I mean, it caught me off guard. And so a world where Bill Bennett is telling us that we don't need liberal arts education, or where Newt Gingrich is saying kids need to be janitors, or where Arizona legislatures are saying Mexican-American kids don't need to learn their history, is also, to my mind, very clearly an attack on the ability of those kids to challenge the world as it is, to challenge a world that says, your history is less important, your heroes are bad people, and you should stay in your place. And, again, that's not the kind of analysis that's going to pass in a lot of company right now. But I challenge folks to push back enough to say, well, is he right or is he wrong? But that's, I think those kinds of dots have to be made for historical literacy. I'll finally end, and this is something I didn't say last time I was here. Not for nothing, COINTELPRO wasn't just about an attack on black militants, or those who were outwardly critical of the state, but also about grassroots activists who were teaching black history to kids. Mm-hmm. And there was those places that, so you can read O'Reilly's Secret Matters, which is the most thorough look at COINTELPRO today, that in FBI's own internal memos are documenting bookstores, sites of cultural literacy and training. So, one memo says that we have sent agents to cover all the places in Harlem that are promoting African culture. So this notion that, Eurocentrism is the invisible white privilege of cultural heritage, that anything that counters that, which we, I think, all recognize as essential to our kids, and that by that I mean the kids we teach, no matter what their backgrounds are, is essential to them having a sense of positive self-conception of themselves and to see themselves in the world, was completely obliterated in a coordinated attack by the federal government that took place 40 years ago. And who knows what echoes continued, because I'm not a researcher of those files. I'll stop there. At the risk of, again, seeming too impractical, I wonder if the frame is inequality. So, to put at the heart of the statement that history education has proven time and time again to be a source of civic engagement to improve the quality of life for all Americans who suffer from tremendous inequality. So essentially taking the indisputable fact that America is in a moment of historical inequality. I mean, we'd have to go back to the 19th century to reproduce levels of inequality today. And then the question is, so if we can agree, right, because there are those, call them plutocrats, if you like, who would disagree. But I think in terms of the constituencies necessary to support something like this, you're not going to get that much pushback. It's not going to be too politically charged to say that this work is about the problem of inequality. And what is the relationship between that problem and historical literacy, of cultural understandings, essentially political, how do we claim to be a country whose greatest gift is democracy, predicated on opportunity, that finds itself at a moment of tremendous inequality? How did that happen? And one of the responses to that is that a citizenry disengaged from his own history didn't know what to fight and defend.
Can you say that again?
No, I can't actually.
A citizenry
disengaged
from its own history didn't know what to fight and defend. So that we trade on, and here again, I'm going to retreat back to the trees for me, because these examples are so prominent in my mind, but you'll all have to hold constant that big idea about inequality. But to me, so you could use labor movement as a classic example. So at some point, the labor movement in the context of the Reagan era became the worst thing that ever happened to America. No surprise we are where we are, right? Or that the notion that a renewed labor movement, a la Bill de Blasio and his $7 billion arrears to the current public workers of New York City is partly a consequence of a set of tax decisions over the last 30 years where we said we want wealthy people to keep more of their money. And we don't have enough to fix our roads or keep the salt piles sufficient, or to educate our kids, or if we're going to try educational reform, we're going to cheat by sticking charter schools in buildings where they don't pay. I mean, you could name all the ways in which we have accommodated a set of tax policies that are at root the cause of that inequality. Now, the difference is that the corporations will say, here, I'm back in the trees, but bear with me for a minute, because I think this is all history informing the analysis, right? Mm-hmm. So you could say that, well, globalization created an economic incentive for American manufacturers to seek cheaper labor. But that does not, by definition, mean that those same corporations have to pay their CEOs or their management classes as much money as they do. Mm-hmm. So you could still literally export. Now that causes a problem, but the problem of taxing those companies creates a different problem, right? You're compounding two problems. So in my fantasy world of sitting at the table and the President of the United States says, so all right, Khalil, you've got all the answers, what's it going to be? And I say, issue an ultimatum to every company in America, right? So you question of what is an American. And you say, if you want to be an American company, if you want to go to bed at night saying, I'm a good American, then you have to pay your people more. And guess what? You can't run to the nearest state because it's a race to the bottom for every state, as Cuomo is now engaging in Rick Perry type policies of, no taxes for the next 10 years. New York State is welcome for business. Or this notion that the minimum wage the increase is gonna lose jobs. Well, say, okay, that's a hiccup, right? But a new baseline means that when you work, you have a quality of life. So all of these questions trade on notions that we've wrestled with for a long time. And the simple fact is that if we really want to wrestle with inequality, if we could imagine a critical mass of Americans rallying around inequality in the context of historical education, then we would at least better understand how we got in this mess, and we would have some sense of how to get out of it. Because letting Boeing shop between Seattle or Illinois or Utah, for the lowest dollar because the employees have demanded too much, is a consequence of a set of decisions at the top that said that those companies need to keep as much money because that's their right, or that the companies need to buy into the political system. So again, those are all symptoms of the problem, and we're all familiar with them. But each one of them, so freedom of contract under Brandeis in 1905 was a lesson learned about the implicit power that corporations have over individuals. So individuals don't, by definition, are not equal parties to employment contract because they have to work, right, to eat. But a Republican vision of America, or a vision of America today, is predicated on universal employment, not because everybody actually has a job that actually can pay you, but on a world without minimum wages. You're literally looking at starvation or anything that somebody will pay you, which is better than nothing, which is essentially the model of the third world or developing countries, because for every dollar more, every marginal dollar they make more above the dollar they didn't make 10 years ago improves their quality of life. But again, you can only see these things. You don't have to have a PhD in American history to see them for what they are, but that's the danger, I think, to the plutocrats. The danger to the plutocrats is that we don't want people walking around making all these connections, and then instead of we're going to give you your taxes back to the folks in Kansas, we're like, you can keep my taxes as long as we have great schools, as long as I have a decent job and I don't have potholes that I'm running over every day. All right, I'm done. But inequality as a framework, as a universalizing problem that is infinitely diagnosable, right, in the language and the evidence that we all have access to, and then to ask the question, can history help us to understand inequality better and to help our children that we teach have a better sense of what it means to be an American, which I would submit doesn't mean being a plutocrat, which is essentially what we are teaching our kids to be.
I have to say this because not only was that amazing, but it also makes the point. We think about this in terms of New York and teaching here. So Khalil's given us this great breakdown of how this has played out, and his frame of reference for all of us in the city of New York who teach New York school children is Lochner versus New York, the case that challenged the notion of liberty to contract. Now, if I don't have the freedom as a teacher because of Common Core or whatever, to be able to engage my students in a larger question about what it means to be an American, core democratic values and liberty to contract challenged in this city, because this city literally, and this would be true of Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, any urban center. In fact, I would submit any community, but your urban centers in particular. You can teach all of American history through the landscape of the history of that community. And Khalil just did it for us very powerfully in the city of New York. So there's all these ways that we can bring all these things together. But it's making the case that we have to reimagine to a certain degree what historical literacy means, and the process of redefining what an American is and what it is that we hope to teach or communicate about what the core of American values are. The National Council for the Social Studies, going back to your point, Jenny, which was a really good one, has these core democratic values for elementary students, and they're culled from the Declaration of Independence and the preamble. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare. If those are our core conversations about fairness, and we teach history around those things, then we are meeting both the conservative demands of, well, when we say what it means to be American, it means, ticking these certain boxes about knowledge of these documents, but also the demand of folks who are saying, but we want to live up to what those things say, not simply know what they mean, but actually live up to the values that they impart. And I think it was really powerful to see you do that in that context, and for us to maybe think around a model of historical literacy that would demand fairness and equality, be engaged with these larger civic questions, but also force people to think about the ways in which their own communities have been the battleground of this fight for fairness and justice across time.
What I've been hearing makes me think of James Baldwin's A Talk to Teachers, because when you think about like the role of education, or the role of teachers, which you brought up, and thinking about teaching history, that really depends upon what it is you expect students to get out of it. What type of civic engagement is it that you want to promote among these urban youth? Because if it extends to what James Baldwin asserts is necessary, is going to be that they become critical of the system in which they're being educated in the communities where this inequality exists, whether it be in labor or whatever have you. And that is not something that I think is welcomed by most of the people who have that authority. And when you look at that, I think that that's not the real goal for the civic engagement that most people would contend that is being welcomed or requested among urban youth. And there's going to be distance and reluctance in engaging young people in that way, because it's inauthentic to what their experience really is. I don't want to talk about the importance of voting. If I'm 16 or 17, these candidates don't represent me. They're not talking about what I care about. How is that going to help me right now? And so I think teaching to a test is dangerous, but having prepared students for the English Regents this year, I think that there's still a way, there's something to be said about knowing how to do something, knowing how to write something, and maybe there are formulas to it. But I think the problem is when it's just in a vacuum. When it's in a vacuum. So my critical lens model was like a mnemonic, and it's based off a quote, so I taught them a quote. But you get to interpret that quote. You get to make the cross-cultural connections. You get to, decide which books you choose to talk about, and you get to make the claim that you are able to prove. So I don't think that it's so much that there is a test as it is the educators who are teaching the students what content they need to be able to grapple with in order to be successful in that subject or on those exams. That's more so the issue that I see there. And I think that if this is really a question of how can we brainstorm and how can we come together to make this history more relevant or more engaging for young people, then we have to be willing to say that those educators or those educators who train the teachers then have to be able to grapple with inequality, and they have to be able to grapple with the things that make this country most uncomfortable. So we can't deny, I can't place the quote, but this notion that like, oh, when you get in the classroom, it's colorblind and the teachers are just going to teach, what's there, and there's, there's no misconceptions. It's not true. And so it's difficult to really teach history and engage in history when you're unable to deal with the bias that you bring into the classroom when you're teaching history, which disempowers the young people who are learning history.
So I was a teacher, and I think a good one when I was a teacher. And I remember going through teacher education, and the history of education, as it particularly relates to black people, is poorly told, if at all. It's as if we're not, I think what I mostly heard was that blacks were not concerned about education, which didn't feel right to me, if only because of the way my parents were. Did you do your homework and all this other craziness that you're going to go through? And so it wasn't until I got to Black History 360 and began to just really look into it for myself that, post-slavery, blacks did two things. They went looking for their families, and they founded schools. And so, and I'm sure the historians would say much more than that, but I'm just saying, what came... that was one of the things that just like resounded in my... I am a religious person, but I don't necessarily mean this religiously, in my soul, that folks went looking for their families because they had been broken apart and split apart and, sold away and all this kind of craziness. And they were largely, they largely did not find their families, unfortunately. But they certainly they certainly set up schools. Some of them were horrible. Some of them were good. And so it's out of that kind of and it's like, so I want to reclaim that, because I think what gets told popularly among young black kids is that, oh, that's for white people. And for the love of God, it isn't. It's just not. It's just one of those things where you're talking about reclaiming the history of education. Can we tell the story that lots and lots of people wanted to be educated? After, over 100 years of being told you can't read and you can't do this, people wanted to learn. Dare I say it, my people wanted to learn. And there's that.
Kimberly, it's even more disturbing than that, as it turns out. So one of the greatest lies and myths about the history of education. So I know a little bit more just because of graduate school as opposed to what I was taught as an undergraduate. But well into the 20th century, arguably up until just before Brown, but you have. So there's this, so the American education as we know it today, and Betty will correct me where I make a mistake, was tied to industrialization. And so compulsory education is part of this Americanization process. But by comparison to the second, third generation immigrants today who wrap themselves in the cloth of being, hardworking Americans, as we hear in our political discourse, they went kicking and screaming to schools. Mm-hmm. Because they were parts of European cultures that were primarily agricultural based, just as was true in the South until black legislators decided that education was critical in the South as a part of the state governments. So what you're describing is so far from the truth that researchers looking back to the 10s, 20s, 30s, 40s, the early migration period outside of the South, you found time and time again black people with far higher rates of attendance in school, far greater commitment, and indisputable evidence, not soft fuzzy stuff that we could still debate. Partly because they had come out of the South where the traditions of schooling were critical for liberation, right? They saw a direct link between if we have access to school, we can do X, Y, and Z. Whereas European immigrants were coming with, essentially more material motivations for household economies that needed more hands on deck. Black families were willing to sacrifice their economic mobility to a degree so that their children would get an education. And that's, I'm sure in the history of education that is extremely well documented. Mm-hmm. It's not well taught, in U.S. history.
It's not taught at all.
I just want to piggyback on what you said because that is such an important point. And I firmly agree that, yes, there is a problem where the type of historical perspective that is presented, it's based on a lack of. Coming from a much more early childhood and elementary background, I'm hearing conversation about middle school, high school, and college. And I don't see why this perspective, this historical enrichment and education cannot start at the younger level. In fact, universal pre-K. It's, again, how would teachers present this? But there's such a wealth of literature and historical references that even a young child can be, enhanced by if they're exposed in a way that makes it relevant and meaningful to them. So, for example, folk tales, historical folk tales, and the history of indigenous populations, not only in New York but throughout the world, and how they're connected. Kids all want to learn about, what is life like, daily life, or even taking from a child's perspective, what would my life be like in an ancient culture? But again, it's the approach. And so I have come up against this all the time, where, I endeavor to teach situations, but it's not part of the structured curriculum. And you get faulted for that. So going back to one of the original things, how do teachers fight against it? I don't know. I don't have the question, and I'm putting it out there. When you're not a union member, you have very little recourse. The unions are getting also weaker. The systems now are charter schools. Charter schools, and union or no, everything's at will. So it's a very precarious place you are in if you really have this burning desire, and you can see to make those connections, and you can even help your scholars, your students, to understand their, civic engagement and beginning to develop a sense of that as young children. It's a real challenge, and I put it out there. How do we really get into the nitty-gritty? Because right now, we're talking a lot of philosophical things, and it's wonderful, but how is it going to transfer? How is it really going to come down to the bottom line? And that's really where the conversation should, kind of get into. What are we doing? The people in charge, you have the power, but what is going to be the result? What are you putting in place of? It's the same old stuff. After all these years of being, I grew up in New York, I'm educated, I went to NYU, and it's amazing how NYU is not even considered Ivy League. I mean, I have no desire or care about names, but, Columbia now has become, it's true, the foremost in terms of education. But I think I got a really good education in terms of my NYU background. Anyway, but bottom line is we're doing our children a disservice. And it's politically designed, and it continues. And so therefore we have parents who do not understand their own power, their own community, the ability to make those changes, to demand the kind of education that they really should have for their kids. They have no clue.
I just wanted to follow up the points you had raised. I think ultimately, from my experience in the classroom teaching, the institutional pressures, especially from New York State, to teach to the test are now so much there, right now that teacher evaluation is tied to it. In the beginning I felt, well, if it's not tied to me, I have more liberty to teach what I want and how I want it. But now, if the Regents exam is the evaluation, there's a huge pressure on teachers to teach to the test, right? And the way the test is structured, which, if you look, there's some room for, historical thinking, but a lot of it is very specific facts, a lot of it is very specific details, and it looks to me more like, Jeopardy, right? Like you could throw up the questions and it could be Jeopardy, relatively obscure topics that you don't have more than, 10 minutes to cover, in the course of the year. And I think fundamentally that's where the problem is, right? We can do great jobs as teacher educators, preparing teachers, and then once they go to the classroom, if they don't have a private school that isn't bound by the New York State Regents, or perhaps a school that has some way to push away the institutional pressures, from New York State, but I think otherwise they're very much. I think they're very much sort of they sort of end up towing the line.
To the debate between history and social studies, and I think people sort of imagine that social studies has this power to challenge the status quo and challenge power structures and all of that, and history is simply about academic knowledge and being able to recite facts. And so what's interesting is, while you may at first see this disconnect between the cultural fluency argument and cultural capital versus being able to challenge the status quo and participatory democracy and citizenship, people have a very hard time connecting history with the power to do that, because they see it simply as studying for the Regents exam and exams and facts and all of that. So I just wanted to echo that, because that's a significant challenge that people face, particularly teachers, because if they're evaluated based on students' test scores, and this is what our society values, is these test scores, and this is the gatekeeper for getting into schools or graduating college, high-stakes tests, it's very hard to say to teachers, no, history can challenge the status quo, and this cultural fluency doesn't simply mean academic knowledge as a factual base, but it's an ability to understand your own community and give you agency and give you power and give you the cultural capital necessary to find your way in the world. And I think it's very hard to help teachers on the ground understand that concept, but also how to do it and how to use history in the classroom to do it, and how to be able to teach historical thinking skills and understand that they're not simply academic skills either. It's not simply literacy. It's not simply reading and writing. That these skills do have power to help kids make their way in the world in whatever way they deem fit.